Coast in California in 1969. Fast forward nearly half a century later, after Santa Barbara, after Exxon Valdez, and the BP oil spill, we are once again fighting to protect our coastlines from an oil spill. Because if President Trump had his way, Earth Day would be Drill the Earth Day. Tomorrow, we anticipate that President Trump will issue yet another damaging environmental executive order, this one on offshore oil drilling. It could put our beaches, our fishermen, and our environment on the East Coast, Pacific, Alaska, and eastern Gulf of Mexico in the crosshairs for an oil spill that could devastate our shores and our economies. So today, 27 senators are sending a letter to call on President Trump not to revise the 5-year Outer Continental Shelf oil and gas leasing plan and to keep the protections on the books for our coastlines. And we are also introducing new legislation that would legislatively prohibit the Interior Secretary from revising the approved offshore drilling plan for those years to open up new areas. Opening up the East Coast to drilling would affect every state from Maine to Florida, not just those where the drilling may occur. As we saw during the BP spill, offshore oil spills don't respect state boundaries. We don't want to threaten the beaches of our states, our fishing, our tourism industries, with the threat of a spill. In New England, we know that oil and water don't mix. We need to make sure that George's Bank never becomes Big Oil's bank. We want our shores and our waters to be home to shellfish and not shell oil. And allowing more drilling in the harsh environment of the Atlantic Ocean off of Alaska has the potential to irreparably damage this fragile ecosystem. We already saw the series of mistakes and safety lapses that occurred when Shell tried to drill offshore in the Arctic. Big oil companies already have leases in the Gulf of Mexico totaling an area nearly the size of Kentucky that are still going unused by the oil companies. There is no reason when they already hold those leases that we should be talking about opening even more areas. We shouldn't jeopardize the vacations of Americans soaking in the sun for the sake of oil companies soaking in profits. Instead of using our coast to drill for oil, we should be harnessing them for clean energy creation. The offshore wind industry has the potential to create tens of thousands of jobs up and down the East Coast, and there is no such thing as a tragic wind spill. So, we have a big choice to make: a future of clean coasts and clean energy, or a future bought and paid for by President Trump's big oil allies. My colleagues and I will do everything in our power to block any attempt to open up the East and West Coast and the Arctic Ocean to drilling that would threaten our states' economies with the possibility of a devastating spill. So I thank you for being here. And now we have an incredible list of champions who are here to let the Trump administration know that they have a battle on their hands. And first, I'd like to introduce the great oceans champion, Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey.
Thank you, Senator Markey, and thank you for your own championship of environmental protection going back to the days in the House when we served together. And I'm thrilled to be joined by Senator Nelson, who has a state that is in which our shore is critical to its economy and its well-being, as well as Senator Blumenthal, who's been a stalwart voice in this regard. I want to start with a brief trip down memory lane, and I really do mean brief. In late 2016, after years of work, the Interior Department finalized its offshore drilling plan for the next 5 years. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I never expected we'd be revisiting the 5-year plan 6 months later. Yet here we are, The Trump administration is prepared to tear up that 5-year plan and let their buddies in the oil industry write up a new one. And it's no surprise that Big Oil has visions of oil rigs from sea to shining sea. Like many business decisions, expanding offshore drilling comes down to a simple cost-benefit analysis. And for oil companies, it's really simple. The initial costs of offshore drilling are paid for by the American people, who see billions of their tax dollars funneled away from things like education and infrastructure into oil company coffers each year. So Big Oil gets to drill, and the American people get the bill. And under this new administration's new tax plan, by the way, taxpayers are sending billions more Big Oil's way. Big Oil also enjoys a cap of $134 million on their liability for the economic costs of spills. And guess what? Huge portions of the penalties they pay are tax deductible as well. For the oil industry, low upfront costs and limits on liability are a recipe for huge profits. But for our shore communities, the risks are high and the rewards are low. Everyone who benefits from living, working, and vacationing along our coast stands to lose. As we saw with Deepwater Horizon spill, the costs of a spill are steep. New Jerseyans are still recovering from the natural disaster of Hurricane Sandy. We don't need a man-made disaster in the form of an oil spill. An oil spill will threaten New Jersey's tourism industry and over 500,000 people that are employed by it. It would wipe out a $7.9 billion fishing industry, endangering another 50,000 jobs and destroying one of the largest saltwater recreational fishing industries in the nation. And it would threaten coastal property values worth over $700 billion in New Jersey alone. The Jersey Shore matters to millions of people, and it's not just to the people of New Jersey. It's a national treasure, home to generations of family vacations, to countless small businesses, to thousands of people who work each day in our thriving, sustainable fisheries. That may not mean anything to BP's bottom line, but it means something to me and the people of New Jersey. It means something to the 120 East Coast communities that publicly opposed Atlantic drilling. And it means something to the 1,200 elected officials, the 35,000 businesses, and the 500,000 fishing families who said no to seismic blasting and no to offshore drilling. And it means something to the overwhelming majority of Americans who want to address climate change and build a clean energy economy. So we're here to speak out for those people. People who may not have the influence that Big Oil enjoys in this administration or this Congress, but who have a long history of beating back efforts to sell our shores to the highest bidder. That's why we're here today, calling on the administration to honor the 5-year plan and introducing new legislation to stop Big Oil from rewriting it. In the coming days, I'm preparing to reintroduce the Coast Anti-Drilling Act, my bill to permanently ban drilling in the Atlantic with a record number of co-sponsors. Today marks the first step in what will surely be a long battle, but we've been here before, and we've won this fight before. And with the support of the American people, I'm confident that we will win once again. Senator Bill Nelson.
There's one area that they will not be drilling in this next 5-year plan, but they'll try. And it's the Gulf of Mexico off the west coast of Florida, because it's off limits in law until the year 2022. So they'll try there for this 5-year plan, but if they're not successful, they'll certainly try with regard to the next 5-year plan. But what about the Atlantic? And that's the subject that we are addressing. Well, I'll take you back to the mid-'80s when this senator was a young congressman and they wanted to drill. There was a Secretary of the Interior named James Watt, and he wanted to drill off the entire east coast of the U.S. This young congressman took them on. The only way that I beat them then was I had to point out common sense that you can't put oil rigs out off of the east coast of Florida where we were dropping our solid rocket boosters from the space shuttle and the first stages from the military rockets coming out of Cape Canaveral. But this fight didn't stop there. It continues all the way until what we anticipate tomorrow, all up and down the eastern seaboard. So don't we have some history that would tell us what happens with an oil spill? You remember 7 years ago, the BP spill? That was off of Louisiana. But there were winds from the west to the east, and it carried the oil and covered up the sugary white sands of Pensacola Beach and Destin. And it got as far east as Panama City Beach. And then the wind shifted and they started taking it back to the west. But you know, we lost an entire season of tourists. Our guests, our visitors, did not come because they had seen the pictures of Pensacola Beach and they thought all the beaches up and down the Gulf Coast had oil slicks. And as a result, the hotels, the restaurants, the dry cleaners, all the ancillary businesses were hurt. Now that's what we're facing again all up and down the Atlantic seaboard. How many more of these disasters do we have to go through to finally realize that there are trade-offs that are not worth the trade-offs? And so, again, we will continue this fight. And I can tell you that this senator, who has been doing this fight for a long time, I'm not stopping. Richard?
Thank you. Unlike my colleagues who are here today, I was never a young congressman. But
You're a young senator.
I have admired them. Somebody tell Bill Nelson I said it, that I have admired them, respected, and really revered their record of championing this cause. And let me just say very simply and bluntly, it takes guts to stand up to big oil. They have a lot of power and a lot of financial resources to fight their opponents. Fighting them is a courageous and strong effort, and I want to say how grateful I am to Senators Nelson, Markey, and Menendez, and all of my 26 other colleagues who have stood up to big oil in this letter, and the legislation that we're going to be introducing, and the legislation that Bob Menendez is going to be introducing shortly. Here it is very bluntly. Picture is worth 1,000 words. That's our future unless we fight now. Big oil right off our coasts, our beaches, our swimmers and fishermen and coastal recreation, which is for Connecticut and every state along the shore, not only a source of enjoyment and environmental treasure, but also money, business, jobs. So if Donald Trump cares about nothing else, you ought to look at the dollar sign. This kind of giveaway to the big oil companies is a net loser for the American people in dollars and cents. Donald Trump promised to drain the swamp, but the multi-headed monster in that swamp, big oil, is emerging once again as a winner. So if Donald Trump really wants to drain the swamp, he will slay that dragon. He will say no to big oil. Increased investment in clean alternatives is America's future. It is America's future in achieving energy efficiency. It means lower energy costs, for consumers and job opportunities for hardworking Americans and new technology that is America's future, and it preserves our natural resources, which is the obligation of the President of the United States to do, and I hope he'll recognize that obligation. In the meantime, we will be standing strong in speaking truth to the power of the big oil companies and the power of the White House.
Questions?
Jonathan Salam with the Star Ledger. You beat back the Atlantic drilling by showing the impact of oil spills, by showing the Defense Department's issues. Can't you just beat this back the same way, the same arguments? Will they work again?
Yeah, Jonathan, I think those will be compelling arguments again. The problem is we just don't think you should be reopening up the plan. So we don't think we have to prove again after years of work. I mean, this plan wasn't just done overnight or a last-minute decision by the Obama administration. This plan went through years of vetting, public hearings, studies, the whole bit. And so after years of work, you have a 5-year plan. So the first point is that we don't think after all of that work that you should just jettison that out arbitrarily and capriciously. But if we somehow have to make the case, you're right. There's a series of issues on navigational shipping. We have the megaport of the East Coast, the port of New York and New Jersey. We have the questions of military exercises off the coast of Florida and Norfolk, Virginia, I meant to mention some, as well as other parts of the East Coast. And we have an economic equation that is overwhelmingly staggering in favor of no drilling as well. For very little, by the way, from basically some studies that have been made, for very little potential oil deposits as it is, when we already have a huge amount of federal land that goes undrilled that has already been open for drilling. So there's no rhyme or reason to reopen the 5-year plan, and that's the main point of our message. We've already done this work. We already have the public vetting. There's no reason to arbitrarily and capriciously open it.
And, you know, by the way, that's an important question. I apologize. That's an important question because as a member of the Armed Services Committee, I've reviewed the national security assessments. They're not classified. They're part of the annual reports and assessments that are done by the Pentagon. And one of the categories is climate change. So if Donald Trump wants to call climate change a hoax, he ought to talk to his generals. It is far from a hoax. It's a national security threat. And exploitation and additional use of fossil fuels simply aggravates that problem at immediate cost, but longer-term national security cost. We're going to have to be prepared for more unrest in other continents, higher tide levels, the impact on the Arctic of additional Russian incursion there because of the ice melting. There are a myriad of national security consequences to climate change.
Yes, sir.
Jack Patrick, Morning Consult. Just to clarify, would this bill permanently stop presidents from meddling in an already done 5-year plan, or is it just focused on the 2017 to 2022?
It's the 5-year plan. The 5-year period, yes.
Yeah, but indefinitely, would this stop a president from
No,
changing?
not indefinitely. No,
Oh.
it's the 5-year plan. Our goal is to keep the 5-year plan.
Our immediate goal that we've all joined together with 24 of our other colleagues is to say, leave the 5-year plan alone. And that's just that, a 5-year plan. At the end of 5 years, a future administration could think about whether or not it wants to institute a new 5-year plan where it could consider drilling in the Atlantic. I separately have a bill called the Coast Act that would permanently take drilling off of the Atlantic, which I think makes a lot of sense, but that's not our focus today.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for speaking. So with all these initiatives, the two pieces of legislation, the letter, I'm assuming there's no Republicans on there, is that correct?
Sure.
And then separately, there's expectation that the Trump executive order tomorrow would reverse the Obama moratorium on mid to North Atlantic drilling and waters off the coast Democrats seem pretty convinced that that's legally perilous, and wondering why that's really the case in light of the fact that George W. Bush rescinded a moratorium from his father in 2008, and there was no litigation that ensued.
Well, we think that we're going to be on strong legal grounds in the courts. We're just saying that there's also going to be a battle here in Congress as well. They have to be prepared for a two-pronged effort to preserve the five-year plan. But there is going to be an army of environmental lawyers who will take the Trump decision to court. And I think that we, as Senator Menendez said, we're going to be standing on very strong ground because it was an exhaustive evidentiary gathering process that we think is going to stand up quite well in the courts.
And yeah, go ahead, David.
The mere fact that another president did it without significant legal challenge doesn't mean that it's now going to withstand legal challenge or that it's even lawful. The fact that somebody runs a red light doesn't mean that it's okay for the next person to run the red light or that they shouldn't be stopped from running a red light. And whatever was done under those circumstances, the facts are different now, and the law should be given a chance to work.
And I would add that I think there is a difference between the moratorium that you referred to and what we're talking about is the five-year plan. That's one thing. And we believe we're in good standing there because we have gone through the whole process, and that is a five-year plan that has been determined after exhaustive process. But there's also the Outer Continental Shelf Act, where President Obama took some elements of the Atlantic and permanently took certain canyons and whatnot out of drilling. And on that issue, we believe that the law is very clear that once a president determines to take permanently off any element of America's natural waters off for drilling, that the law provides for no provision to relist it. And so that would certainly, if attempted to be challenged, we don't know that that will be part of the executive order, but if that gets challenged, or I mean, if that is pursued by the administration, that will have a huge legal challenge to it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for taking my question. Elvina Namaguda with the CQ. Obviously, you're going to need Republican colleagues if this bill is to go anywhere. What's your plan to get some of them on board, and do you know any who might be even willing to share your position?
Well, without mentioning any names, would just say that in general, if you're a Republican senator and you have a coastline, that this is something that jeopardizes the tourism industry, the fishing industry, the very identity of your state. So what we're beginning here today is a political education process. There's going to be a fight, and ultimately, the more intensity is built around this issue, the more citizen activism that is created around this issue, is the greater the likelihood that we will find Republican support, because these issues poll out at very high numbers on a bipartisan basis in terms of whether or not people want their state's identity to be compromised by big oil.
And I would add to that the 120 East Coast communities that publicly opposed Atlantic drilling, the 1,200 elected officials, the 35,000 businesses, the 500,000 fishing families that spoke out, those aren't just in our states. Those are up and down the East Coast, including in states, as Senator Markey said, who have senators who are Republican. And in addition to that, while we are promoting legislation, the other reality is that there are other ways to get the hearts and minds of an administration. And certainly in the appropriations process, when we go through the regular full year appropriations process and we come to the Department of Interior and Department of Energy and other things, there are opportunities for us to use, when you have 27 members of the Senate who stand opposed to something, that's hard to get to 60 votes. So the reality is there are many other ways to find leverage to get the administration to rethink their calculus.
And let me mention one more point at the risk of saying something that's obvious, because we did just finish Earth Day, and I attended 2 rallies last Saturday. I'm sure my colleagues went to rallies in their states. The energy and passion around this issue is unparalleled in my number of decades being on this planet. The kind of passion and energy is incomparable, and it's growing. It's a movement. It's something that our colleagues are going to have to heed. And for them to be in denial politically, as well as scientifically, is going to be consequential for them at the polls. And they're going to get that message.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Lauren McDevitt with First Television. So what should our long-term energy strategy look like? I know you mentioned wind. And realistically, what role does oil play in that?
Well, that's an excellent question. The law right now calls for 54.5 miles per gallon for the fuel economy standards of the vehicles which we drive by the year 2025. Donald Trump has now called for a review of America's ability to meet that standard. Well, if you couple the two, that takes care of the auto industry that doesn't want to meet that standard, and it takes care of the oil industry that wants to produce more oil in order to deal with an auto industry that will not be as efficient as the existing law then requires them to meet. But simultaneously, Tesla, Elon Musk, has 400,000 people on a waiting list with $1,000 apiece to buy a $35,000 all-electric car that's coming out next year. And he intends on selling 500,000 of them, which requires no oil to be in the tank. So going forward, as long as we understand that 70% of all oil goes into gasoline tanks, and that we have a strategy which would avoid the necessity of risking our beaches in order to provide that oil, then we're ready for this debate with Donald Trump, because we can definitely link the agenda of big oil, to this potential desecration of these sacred places in every state. And every state does view their beaches as special sacred places. So that would be the agenda. And in the absence of Trump acting in these two ways, we would have been able to avoid having more oil have to be drilled for, because oil consumption is going to go down as each year goes by.
And the other thing, I think most Americans would be shocked to know that in all the federal lands and waters that we have opened up to drilling for oil, that there is no obligation to keep that oil here in the United States. I think most people, when I look at those advertisements by the industry on television of talking about American energy independence, they don't tell Americans that, in fact, oil is a global commodity that is exported to the highest bidder. So you drill on federal lands and waters, but you don't keep that oil here necessarily. So at the end of the day, who are we drilling for? Is it for American energy independence, or is it just to add to the global oil market? And the answer to that question, at least as of now, is to add to the global energy market, but not for American domestic consumption.
And to put an exclamation point upon that, when I was a young congressman in the House with Bob Menendez,
when I was even younger than
when they would attempt to drill for oil off of the East Coast, I would always bring the amendment out to make sure that every Republican had to vote on keeping the oil that was drilled for in the United States. And each time, every Republican voted no. So when you hear the president invoke tomorrow the national security of America, the first question you should ask him is, will all that oil stay in the United States? Because the Keystone oil is going out of America. Okay? It's going down to Louisiana, and then it's just getting on ships, and it's going to the highest bidder in the world. That's one thing. That's Canadian oil. This would be American oil coming at the risk of our beaches that would then be put in ships, and they will not oppose that exploitation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you all. Thanks.